So this is going to be a pretty long video. I wanted to break down all the electronics and mechanics involved in making one of these tables work. So I'm going to break this down into various sections. Feel free to jump to the section that's most relevant to what you're currently working on. I'm also going to go over the controller board I'm going to be offering. And at the end of this video, I'll be kind of showing you what everything looks like when it's all together. So here's my controller board as it stands today, and while I might be making some changes to it in the future, this is the board I'll be shipping out in a few weeks from now. This controller board is certainly not the only way to make your knobs and lights and buttons do things, but I wanted to offer a solution to make it easier for you builders to get your tables working. So feel free to get creative with other ways to make these work and share those within the group, but this is the option I'll be providing myself and supporting. I'm hoping that it makes things a lot easier for those of you that might be new to this sort of thing. But I just want to give you a quick tour of the board itself. So you see up here, there is a USB mini port. That's where it gets its power. It gets 5 volts from an adapter that's included with the board. You can turn it on and off by either pressing this little momentary switch here, or by plugging one of your knobs or buttons into the power pins over here. So each side, A and B, can both have their own power button. All of my LEDs can be plugged in up here with DuPont pins or with the provided ribbon cables that come with my LED kits. And you'll see there's a side A and a side B and 13 LEDs for each of them. And then down below those are each of my buttons, all 54 of the buttons, split for each side, 27 on each side. And then in the middle here, we have pins for 2 knobs for each side and 2 buttons for each side. The whole thing is powered by this Arduino Nano, which has the program on it. The code is available. You can modify the program by just plugging into the USB port here and reprogramming it. And then it has a serial MP3 player board here that has a 2 GB SD card in it, micro SD card that's loaded up with MP3 files, but you can modify those MP3 files as well. The board can also be powered by a battery power pack that you use to charge a cell phone, and you can power it through this USB port here on the Nano for constant power, or through the USB port up here if you want it to be controlled by the power button. It also has a plug-in for an LCD screen on both side A and B, and those both receive serial communication from the Nano, letting them know what to display. You could probably also hack into that serial out to write your own software or have it communicate to a third-party board, but right now that serial is meant for the LCD screens. I wanted to talk a little bit about rotary encoders because there's a lot of different options here. And I just wanted to go over them a little bit. So these are what we're using for buttons and knobs on the table. They have a click when you push them. They can be used as a momentary switch, or when you turn them, they can be used as an adjustment knob, setting levels up and down. And if you look at the bottom of one, you'll see it's got 2 prongs here, which is the momentary switch, and 3 prongs over here, which sends pulses out for our up and down if we wanted to make an adjustment knob. And these come in 2 very distinct styles. One with a smooth shaft, sort of a D-fitting shaft there. It's meant for a set screw or something like that. And then one with a knurled shaft. And the knurled shaft right now is the kind I'm recommending. And the reason for that is, when you get your table, you'll notice that most of these knobs have a 6mm hole on the back of them, and they're really loose when you put them on. But if you take a flathead screwdriver and you just kind of widen the top of it, spread these little tabs apart from one another, you get a much tighter fit without any slippage. So the knurled fittings generally have a way for you to spread these 2 apart for a really, really snug fit on these metal parts. And then you're going to see different lengths. So there's Here's a 20 millimeter shaft and a 15 millimeter shaft. And my table parts are meant for a 20 millimeter shaft. So these come in various lengths, but we're using 20 millimeter for these files. Now, those of you with version 1 tables are going to find that a 20 millimeter just sticks out way too far. So if you put one of Phillips knobs on it, for instance, it's just going to be way too obnoxious looking. So you can remedy that by either using a 15 millimeter shaft rotary encoder. Again, you probably want one with a knurled shaft on it, not the smooth D-style shaft. And when you screw that guy in, your knob will sit much closer to thing there. Otherwise, I have these spacers that I made, and you can take your rotary encoder, your 20 millimeter shaft rotary encoder, screw that into that as far as you want it to go. And glue this printed part behind, and that gives you a much lower, so these are both 20 millimeter shafts, but with the spacer you end up with a much better fit. All set and ready. These are also really loose on the version 1 sometimes, just because there's not a lot of meat for the threading to grab in the print. So I recommend printing out a set of these spacers, and you can just glue them into, you can glue the spacers themselves directly into the print, like so. You can clean it out with a round file or something like that, and then thread your rotary encoder into the spacer. Hopefully that's clear. I'm going to be selling some rotary encoders on my website, and they come with a little PCB just to make things easier. They've got the button side and the knob side, so you can pick which type you want to use it as. They're easy to screw in because they've got these divots on the sides, and you can just screw these in easier, and they come with a plug that you can plug in to either side. So those will be available right now for pre-order, and then I'll have them on the website later, but that's not necessary. That's just for those of you that don't want to put as much effort into it, maybe. You can solder directly to these rotary encoders and order whichever encoders you want and get the same result. Screw them in by hand without doing much to them, and you'll be set to go. See, this is one I made for my older table. I just soldered directly to those leads, put a piece of shrink wrap over it, and all set and ready to go. So that's a bit about the encoders. All right, now moving on to the keys and key tray options. So you'll find that in all my designs, I make use of these mechanical keyboard keys. And I did that basically because you can get them in big batches, because they're meant to replace all the keys on a keyboard. And they're pretty low profile once installed, and they have a great feel on them. There's also variance in resistance and sort of clickiness of these keys. And that's usually what the color on the top of the key indicates. So if you're looking at these, there's a billion different brands and different colors. The color basically designates how it's going to feel when you press the key. And these mechanical keyboard communities get really involved in how they want it to feel when they type. So there's just a lot of options out there. I like the greens because they have a lot of resistance on them, and they have a great clicking sound, and they seem to work pretty well for these big keys we're using. And so you'll find on all my key trays, they're meant to accept a switch like this, a mechanical keyboard switch. Here's two different brands. This is a Cherry MX switch, which is sort of a more premium brand. And here's a Gatoron switch, which is the same feel, but it's a little more cost-effective, if you can find them. Both of these work great. You won't notice probably any difference between the two. And there's different versions. Some are PCB mount and some are not. So if you get my PCBs without the switches on them, which is an option, you can install the switches you want. Just make sure you get the PCB version. Otherwise, if you're using key trays, it doesn't matter which version you get. Just make sure they have the plus symbol at the top so that it'll accept the stem. The keys themselves attach to these switches using these printed keycaps I made. If you're lucky enough to have a resin printer, you can potentially print the keycap and the stem directly into the key. So you don't need to worry about these printed keycaps. And then they'll just click right on there without much effort. But you want to make sure these are fitting nice and tight so they're not loose and coming off on you. So it might take some playing around with your print settings to get that just right. Otherwise, you can print out these caps and they should fit snug. And if they don't, play around again with your extrusion width or things like that just to make sure they fit nice and snug. But these fit directly onto the key. And what you want to make sure is that these MX switches have a smooth back and a notched front. We want the notched front to be facing outward from the table, so facing you when you're installing it. And then the keycaps themselves have a slant on them, you're going to notice. So when I push the keycap on, you'll see it's kind of slanted backward. And that's after lots of trial and error. When I put the keys on, I found that when you press them, they want to kind of go forward and or scrape against the back. So this kind of prevents that from happening. So make sure that the slant is going backward and that your key is slanted at that angle. Now, if you're using a version 1 key tray, you're going to find this is unfortunately not a very good design. Just the way it fits in, this had to be extremely thin. So a lot of people are having trouble printing this. If you're having trouble printing it, send me a private message and I might be able to help you through it. Otherwise, I've noticed once they're glued into the version 1 table, this back is well supported on like a lip that's in there. So if you glue these in and finish up your table completely, they should be nice and sturdy. And once you get the keys installed, there shouldn't be any flex at all. And they're nice and strong. I was putting like 20 pounds of pressure on one once they're installed, and there's no breakage or anything like that. So it might be a little disconcerting how flimsy these version 1 trays are. But once you get them installed, I don't think you'll find much issue with them. And again, install the tray on a version 1 table, glue it in, and sand and finish your whole table with the trays in so that you can get rid of this seam. And then once you're done, you can just drop the switches in, just push them into the tray, and they should just fit in there and they won't come out. The version 2 key trays, on the other hand, are a much better design. They're thicker, they're more sturdy, and you finish up your whole table and install these last by screwing them in, which means that if you ever need to do maintenance on them or anything, you can unscrew them, flip them over, and work on them that way. But both essentially get wired up the same way, and unfortunately, it's a bit of a tedious process. And so there's a couple ways to do this. So again, we talked about those two leads on the bottom of each key. So essentially what you're going to do is pick a wire that you like to work with. On one of my tables I use this twisted wire, or you can just use like a red and black wire. Again, there's no polarity to this, so it doesn't matter which color solders to which stem. But what you're going to do is on one end, you're probably going to want a DuPont connector. And if you've never done this before, there's some YouTube videos out there that'll show you how to do this, but you use a set of crimpers and you use these little metal things that you break off, and then you crimp these guys onto your wire, and then once they're crimped on, you slide on one of these plastic 2-pin shafts, and you're ready to plug that into your control board or whatever you're using, and run that back to your switch. So we can feed each of these crimped wires into the holes and solder our ends to these stems on the switch. Now, it's really tedious when you're doing 54 of those. That's the way I did my first tables. And so I want to make this a little easier for the version 1 guys. So I have these PCBs that I printed up, and I will mail you one of these just for the cost of the postage. But the way these work is you basically break these apart, and these fit onto the bottom of your MX switch, and it adds some nice, better solder points. It's kind of tough soldering those little stems, so this adds some solder points. And then you can pretty easily solder these wires to those pads. So this might make your job a little easier. The other thing I'm doing is I'm adding a ribbon cable. So if you want these ribbon cables, these are a little extra work and money. So you can buy one of these. You can also get, or sorry, if you get one of these, you can also get these, but they'll probably cost like $15 or something like that. And I'll crimp you up a bunch of these ribbon cables. And how these work is they split apart pretty easily, and you can tear them apart. And they're really tiny wires, so to strip them, I usually use a razor blade, and I just very, like a 1/4 inch in, I very gently score it, and then I just pull it with my fingernail, and it should strip there. And then that tiny little wire would then get soldered to that pad. But the problem is with all of these, you're going to find you need some tension relief. If you pull on the wires, they could break loose from these. So there's a couple ways to do tension relief. One way I've found is if you take your wire and you solder it to both pads so that it's going away from the arrow on the PCB, end up with something like this. And then if you loop the wire around, going back toward that arrow, and you put a glob of hot glue in that mess there, like this, then you'll find it's got really good tension relief on it. You can yank on that wire and it's not going to come off of the key. And so that's ready to install. The other way is if you have some really thin wire. This is 28 gauge wire. If you look in this switch, you're going to see there's 2 little holes in there. And what I do is I feed this wire through both of those holes. And then once your wire is fed through, you just twist it around your wire there, crimp it. And then when this is pulling over, again, you have good tension relief. It's not going to pull on those pads. You're not going to have any worry about it breaking off of the MX switch. Now, if you've got that ribbon wire I was talking about earlier, it's already got an IDC connector on the end, so you don't need to crimp all those individual DuPont wires that I was talking about before. And this thing's just ready to plug in to your controller board. So on the other end, what you're going to do is you'll rip the wire into sections of 2, and you'll feed each of these through the holes on the back of your print. Just make sure you keep them in order so that when you're later on trying to figure out what number each switch is, it's not going to be an issue. And then that should come out your key tray on the other side, and it's ready to wire to your switch. So you can feed all those wires through, cut them all so they're the same length, and solder all your switches to them the way I just showed you. So that process is nearly identical for the version 2 key trays, except now there's one central hole. So you're either going to run your crimped DuPont wires, all of them through that hole, and there's 9 keys per tray, so you'd be running 9 of these through, and then solder that into your key. Or you can use that ribbon cable I talked about earlier, feed that into the table, solder each of those ends to your keys. Just like so. Once you're done, you can just screw it in, and you should be set to go. Now, for those of you who might not be good at the soldering or might not want to be doing the crimping or all that other mess, I'm offering these printed circuit board key trays that are pre-assembled, pre-soldered, they're plug and play and ready to install. You don't really have to fiddle with any of that. I just wanted those of you who want to do it yourself or do it on the cheap to have an option. but these will also be available for those of you that want to skip all that. They just drop in into the thing, you screw them in, and then they have a ribbon cable that plugs in on the back and plugs back to your controller board. So if you're using printed keycaps, you might be tempted to glue your keycaps directly into all your keys before you get going. And I wouldn't really recommend that. And the reason is because this keycap can move around a little bit. And it might be farther to one side or the other, or closer to the front than the back, or maybe it's angled or not as deep. And so then what ends up happening is when you put all your keys on, they're not quite spaced correctly, and they might look a little funny compared to one another. And so what I recommend doing is installing all of your Cherry MX switches, getting your table completely finished, and then putting a dab of glue on the top of each of your keycaps once they're installed, and then placing your keys onto that glue so that you can position them the way they're going to be on the table, get the spacing just the way you want it, and the angles just the way you want it, and get everything nice and uniform, and then when that glue sets up, that's the way it's going to be. So again, just a little glob of glue. I'd use something like E6000 or Gorilla Clear Grip, something that's kind of thick and lets you adjust them around, and then once they're all set up, they should be just the way you want them. So now moving on to the lights on the table. Anything you can make or find that will fit into the 1/2-inch diameter hole on the print file will work just fine. But I wanted to show you a couple things I've come up with that might work for you as well. So as you saw in my earlier video, I was using PEX pipe. You can use PVC pipe or PEX pipe, cutting that up into pieces. As long as it's got a 1/2-inch diameter or outer diameter, it should work just fine. And then I was gluing it to these acrylic discs. These look a lot like the discs in A New Hope. I'm using 5/8 by 1/8 inch discs, acrylic discs. You can either get these laser cut from a local supplier, or I sell them as well in my store. And with the PEX, I figured I could probably just insert like a 10mm LED in there. Any LED that can run on 5 volts will work with my controller board. So you can also buy pre-wired LEDs, and if they're meant to run at less than 5 volts, just make sure they've got an inline resistor. Usually when you buy a pre-wired LED, it's set up and ready to be powered with an inline resistor. So you can just buy pre-wired LEDs on Amazon. I also make these printed tubes, these printed housings. They're with the print files with the table. And they're meant just to accept a 5mm LED on the back. And then you can glue them in and just fit them into your hole, and then glue your acrylic disc to that print. But I found that just the disc itself isn't really diffused very well, and I'll show you what I mean. So if I take an LED that's blinking and I put this over, you'll see I'm pretty much just looking at the LED through that lens. And so the best way I found to diffuse those, it's kind of silly, but I just take a piece of Scotch tape, just regular Scotch tape, and tape it to the back of that acrylic disc. And then I take my X-Acto knife and I cut that out. End up with something like this, and you'll see that that gives a nice soft diffusion. So now if we glue this to our print, which I'll show you how to do here in a second, we end up with a good looking diffused light. So the way I glue these is pretty simple, but you want to take your print and make sure that the top is very flat. So you might want to rub it on some 220 grit sandpaper or something like that, just so that you've got a nice flat surface to deal with here. And then this is my favorite glue to use. It's this Zap brand thin CA glue. It wicks really fast. You'll see it's like got the consistency of water in there. And it's really easy to work with as long as you're using very small amounts. Basically what I do is I get something that's really slick. So usually I found here's a piece of reflective aluminum tape, and when I peel that off of this, I end up with this really slick piece of paper. This is like the same stuff on the back of stickers and whatnot. When I put my glue on there, and it doesn't stick, it flows around. So the super glue just sits there. And then I take a toothpick, soak it around in the glue, take my light, get it nice and centered on that acrylic disc, push down on it with a fair bit of pressure, and then just dab the toothpick around the edge to make sure the glue soaks in there real nice. And that's it. So once you've done all that, you should end up with a nice homemade hollow chest light that you can just insert into your print. And it should work out great. As with everything else, I make a pre-made version of this that comes in a nice metal tube. You can solder the leads just right onto the back, or I can pre-solder them for you. And these just insert in. And they come with a controller board that you plug them into, or a little receiver board that then plugs into the controller board. And it comes nice and diffused, and something to consider. So hopefully that's given you some ideas on how you might hook up your lights. So here's the board all hooked up. The board will come with a 6-foot USB mini cable with a wall adapter, so you can just run it down the bottom of your table and plug it in to the wall. So that's what's going on here. And you'll need to provide your own amplified speaker setup and hook it up to the board via a headphone cable or an aux cable. But the speaker needs to be amplified, but you can use any amplified speaker setup. I'm just using a battery-powered Bluetooth speaker right now. I'll probably upgrade to something more intense later, but that's getting the job done for now. And then I have all my keys being plugged in via ribbon cables here. So each ribbon goes to a key tray bay. Each key tray bay has 9 keys on it. So I have 3 ribbons. Then I have my LEDs plugging in here via a ribbon. This goes back to my light kit, which has sort of a breakout board here that all the lights plug into. But you can use pre-wired LEDs and just plug them into these pins via DuPont cables. And then each of the knobs and the LCD screens come out of these wires here. And to turn it on, you just press the button you have plugged into the power pins here, which I put as the one all the way on the end here. Now that it's getting power, you can see the LCD screen comes on and all the lights come on. When the board starts up, it's in display mode. To change the mode, I press this button here.
Game mode.
That turns it into game mode.
Music mode.
Music mode.
Display mode.
And back to display mode. This one here is going to turn on and off my sound. And then the knobs over here, one's right now just an adjustment knob. It's doing the game length right now, but it can be anything we want it to be. And then this one here controls the volume. When it's in display mode, these buttons right now are just playing monster sounds. The program's still in process, so I'm still doing a lot of programming, and a lot of this is subject to change. But right now I have this just playing generic monster sounds when you press the buttons. When it's in game mode, it'll play the game. I'm not going to go through all of that right now, but it plays almost exactly the same as my old table did. I'll post that video so you guys can see what that was like. And then in music mode, and right now I just did this today, so it's a little loud, so I'm going to turn it down. Each of these buttons becomes a piano key. And that's about it right now. So the board will be programmed to do various things with the lights. For instance, when I'm in game mode and I hit this button on the end, it rolls a dice. And then, you'll be able to select your monsters and have them fight each other and stuff like that. And then, obviously, in the display mode, you can have it do whatever you want it to do via the program. But anyway, it's a work in progress. But the board right now, as it comes, will come with sounds and a basic program on it that will do everything I just showed you. And that should be available now for pre-order. And it should be shipping within the coming months. Thank you for watching. I hope you found this video informative. Some of the electronics you've seen in this video are already available on my website at dejarikcreations.com/store. I hope you enjoy this project, and let me know if you have any questions.